Welcome to this Take 20 special on the final days of Jesus. I'm Pastor Phil Moser, and I'm glad that you have joined us. We are shortly entering into what Christians call the Passion Week of Christ. The word passion is from the Latin pati, which simply means to endure or to suffer. It often references the final days of Jesus' life. It is one of the most important celebrations that we as Christians have grown accustomed to. Even if you're only a casual believer, days like Christmas and Good Friday and Easter are important, and typically the time when Christians come together. This year will be different. With the looming COVID-19 crisis, the church will not be gathering but will be scattered. It is our hope that if you take 20 minutes a day with us for the next week, we can take a glimpse back at those final days of Jesus' life. Now, to introduce you to those final days of Jesus' life, that last week or that Passion Week, I want to take the 20 minutes today and simply talk to you about all of Jesus' ministry. In fact, I want to compress 3.5 years into 20 minutes with you. When you think of Jesus' ministry as explained in the gospel, you will find that it breaks down into two areas: what we call the public presentation, that's about 2.5 years, and the private preparation, that's about 1 year. That public presentation, that is the events that you know of Jesus' life, usually carries two different categories. One is the 10 to 12 months that he spends in Judea, and the other is a 1.5 years that he will spend in Galilee. Now, I like to remember that how he spent his time in Judea at the very beginning of his ministry with the 3 J's. But before I do that, just let me introduce you to the geography of the nation of Israel. Many of you probably have never been to Israel, but you can compare Israel to a state in the United States of America. It is about the same size and it's about the same shape, and that's our state of New Jersey. So just think about this for a second. When we talk about Jesus' ministry, it's all taking place in an area that's really nothing more than about 90 to 110 miles in north and south, and less than that in its east to west. The first part of Jesus' ministry, I remember with the 3 J's, because Jesus was ministering in Judea, and that ministry is told only in the Gospel of John. Jesus in Judea, only in John. In fact, that first part of his ministry has a number of firsts. It's not only the first 10 to 12 months of his public ministry, it's his first calling of disciples, it's the first where the first miracle occurs, it's the first cleansing of the temple. It's also the first mention of Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and it's his first interaction with the socially outcast in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. That covers roughly 10 to 12 months, Judea, about Jesus, told only in the Gospel of John. But that next 1.5 years in Galilee are the stories that most of us know. In fact, there, when Jesus is in the northern portion of the land of Israel, we find that certain things happen. He forgives the sins of the paralytic. This is important. He doesn't just heal, he demonstrates he's God by forgiving sin. He intentionally offends their Sabbath. That is, he looks at the religious leaders and says, I know you have these laws that you have made up, but I will intentionally offend them to show you that I am God. I am superior to your man-made laws. He will choose 12 apostles. He will heal 2 blind men in the early part of that ministry, and that's important because the Old Testament prophecy said that the Messiah that would come would heal the blind. He will raise a widow's son who is dead, and the Old Testament prophesied again that God had the power to raise the dead. He will teach his incredible Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. He will still the storm in Matthew 8. Demons will recognize him in Mark chapter 5. And John's disciples will come inquiring, is this really the Messiah? And he will say, go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And then those miracles that we are familiar with. He will feed 5,000 people. All of those miracles take place in the northern portion of the kingdom. That is what we know as the Galilee area or the Sea of Galilee. And I like to remember this with as a 3G network. 3 trips in Galilee told only in 3 Gospels. And we say there's 3 trips because he actually makes 3 venues out into the synagogues preaching from Galilee. He does those 3 efforts in Luke chapter 4 and Luke chapter 8, and later he goes again in Luke chapter 9. Now, all of that's important, but that's not the most important. The most important is that while Jesus is proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, eventually the people reject him. And we find that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 23. And I like to call this a hinge event in the ministry of Jesus. It's one of those moments where all of a sudden Jesus tests those who are following and they reject him. There he commits this, he heals this man with the withered hand. He does this incredible miracle like none of the others that he does, because he doesn't touch the man. He simply says, lift your hand, and as the man lifts his hand, his withered hand becomes whole again. He was doing this miracle on the Sabbath, therefore proving again that he was superior to their laws. What happens next is when a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, Jesus healed him so that the man spoke and saw. And the text says, and all the people were amazed and said, can this be the Son of David? Now, most of our English translations render it that way, but what's important to remember is that the Greek language actually has two negatives here. The New American Standard gets it the clearest when it says, this man cannot be the Son of David, can he? In other words, they are saying, no, he cannot be. They do not want to follow him. They love his miracles. They love the fact that he feeds them fish and chips on the seashore, but they don't want to follow. In fact, they give themselves up to the Pharisees in that moment, and the Pharisees answer and say, this man cast out demons by the prince of demons. The Pharisees look for answers, but they have no answers. And the rejection of Jesus begins to take place right here at the end of the Galilean ministry. Jesus, from there on out, does a number of things, but one of the things he does is he begins to teach in parables. Now, this is important because if you were always thinking that he taught in parables to make things clearer, the truth of the matter is he taught in parables to make things clear to those who wish to believe. But to those who were unbelieving, the parables concealed the truth. Jesus, therefore, acknowledges the rejection, and he begins to teach the people in parables. In fact, this is the public presentation of Jesus in those first 2.5 years. Before you ever get to that final week of Jesus' life, you need to know that Jesus was preaching and healing and teaching, and in everything he did, he was presenting himself to the nation of Israel as the Messiah and as God. In fact, Peter actually acknowledges that in Matthew chapter 16. It's a familiar verse, but it's worth noting. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, Jesus asked the question a little earlier in verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answers rightly when he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's a great reminder that Peter got it right, but most of the others didn't. Now, this is important because what's happening in the earlier part of Jesus' ministry is that he is always proclaiming to be the Messiah, but he does it in a secretive way. He does it in a way simply by tapping Old Testament prophecies, things from the Old Testament that people would have recognized, oh, that's a messianic issue. That's one where the Christ, the Messiah who will come, will do. That's a miracle he will do. That's something he would say. Over and over again, Jesus does that. And why that's important is because it allows him to present himself as king without the Romans, that is, those who were overrunning Israel at the time, without them recognizing him. They would have recognized a king on a white horse riding in, taking over, and attempting to take on Rome with swords and with shields, attempting to attack the nation of Rome. But they would not have recognized someone who said, I am the Messiah, I am God, because I fulfill the Old Testament prophecies. It was an incredible way for the Jews to be forced to recognize him, and the Romans unable to recognize him. In fact, when you read the gospel account, if I could summarize all of those 3.5 years with 4 statements, here they are. Jesus will claim to be the Messiah. He usually encodes that in Old Testament prophecy. Number 2, the people will receive him, though they do that superficially. And the moment they do, Jesus tests them. And the moment he tests them, they will reject him. And that culminates in Matthew chapter 12, verse 23. All of that to say, that's the public presentation. It's meant to present Jesus as the Messiah and as God. But then we enter into an entire year of his ministry that we call the private preparation. He pulls away from all of those big public meetings, and he enters into a time with the disciples where he is speaking to them and preparing them for his upcoming crucifixion and resurrection. And that also is found most clearly in that passage in Matthew chapter 16. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, for this shall never happen to you." In fact, Jesus presented himself to the disciples, saying, "Listen, I'm going to tell you I'm going to be crucified." And the disciples instead said, "No, people shouldn't suffer." It's a great moment for me to just tap in a brief tangential kind of way that we still think that way, don't we? We as a nation and as a global humanity face an incredible crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. For some reason, most Christians believe that Christians shouldn't have to suffer. We, like Peter, would say, if Jesus were here, "Oh no, Lord, not you. You shouldn't have to suffer." But notice what Jesus said next. He said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Peter, that is a satanic way of thinking. And then he goes on to say, "For you are not thinking the way that God thinks. You're thinking the way that man thinks." Jesus, in that private preparation of an entire year, prepares his disciples for his crucifixion and resurrection. We notice in that, even though he seems distant, not in this area of Galilee, he makes 3 separate trips to Jerusalem. Each time it says that he is moving towards Jerusalem, and the text actually says that he is setting his face to Jerusalem. He turns, knowing what is coming, and he heads there. Knowing that the Passion Week is going to show up shortly, he goes there. During that year, he goes during the Feast of Booths. He's challenged by his brothers in John chapter 7, verse 2, to go there. The text goes on to say that his brothers don't really believe in him. Bear in mind that this stage in Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders, want desperately to either trap him, discredit him, or kill him. So Jesus is in private hiding, and when he moves into public, he's always in a crowd, so they can never have access to him. In John chapter 7, he actually goes, in verse 10, he went publicly, the text tells us, to Jerusalem, but he didn't go when his brothers told him to. He went later. In John chapter 10, verse 22, he also goes a second time to Jerusalem in the temple, and it's winter, and he's walking there in the portico. He's walking and teaching again in public so that those religious leaders cannot access him. And finally, in John chapter 11, this incredible story where he raises Lazarus, perhaps the miracle that pushed the religious leaders over the edge, because they could no longer deny that he was not only Messiah, but that he was God, having the ability to raise a man who had been dead for several days. In fact, Bookman says that Israel's besetting sin was crafting a Messiah that they liked better than God's. They wanted a conquering Messiah who pandered to Israel, but what they got was a humble Messiah who confronts Israel. The Passion Week of Jesus, every time he walks up into the temple to teach or to overthrow the tables, is confrontational. He is telling them, if you really believe I am the Messiah, then follow me. And the people refuse. In these opening days of Jesus' ministry, in that final week, we discover these truths. He presents himself publicly as the Messiah to all of Israel. He does that in the miracles and the teaching that he commits. For that last year, he has pulled himself away privately, trying to prepare his disciples for his upcoming crucifixion and resurrection, most clearly stated in Matthew chapter 16. Today, can I challenge you with this thought? Remember what Jesus said to Peter. What he said to Peter is, "Who do men say that I am?" He said this long before the Passion Week. He wanted to know, who do men say that I am? And Peter answered, and the disciples answered. But then he said, "Who do you say that I am?" We are not all that different from the New Testament Israelites. We're not all that different from those Jews in Jesus' time who wanted a Messiah to be what we wanted. But when he asks us to go through difficult times, through challenging times, through heartbreaking times, it's harder for us to submit, isn't it? We'd rather not follow at that stage. Please remember, as we prepare for Palm Sunday and the Passion Week, that two of the most important words Jesus says in the gospel record to the disciples are these: follow me, follow me, follow me. And he asks us to follow, he asks them to follow, and he asks us to follow him too today. I'm Phil Moser, sharing this final 20 on the final days of Jesus' life.